Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Citrus Research Board and UC IPM webinar on managing burrowing rodents in citrus. I'm Stephanie Pereira with the UC statewide IPM program. Peter Cosina is also here with me, and he'll be running the polls and troubleshooting any technical problems. Please note that Peter and I are both working from our homes, so this may affect the quality of our audio connection a little bit. Please note that this webinar is targeted to growers and agricultural pest management professionals. Master gardeners can certainly benefit from participating, but the pest management methods presented, especially the pesticides, are not to be followed without a clear understanding of their legal use in home environments. So our speaker today is Roger Baldwin, and he will be speaking on managing burrowing rodents in citrus. So I will pass the mic over to Roger at this point. Roger, you can share your slides.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So yes, as mentioned, I am going to be talking about an integrated approach to managing burrowing rodents in citrus crops. As we get started here this morning, I did think I wanted to very quickly mention that I work in a variety of different cropping systems, and so my talk today is going to be specifically focused on rodent management in citrus, but understand a lot of my photos are going to be coming from a variety of different crops. So you'll see all kinds of representation from that perspective. So to get started, I thought we would first provide some introductory information about the different species that I'm going to be covering here today, focusing primarily on four. The first one I'm going to be talking about is the ground squirrel. I'm sure most of you are familiar with California ground squirrels, but they certainly are very common throughout the state. They are grayish brown in color and have a semi-bushy tail. I'm sure, like I said, many of you have seen them before, but they do have that kind of mottled or speckled type appearance associated with their fur. They are also social, and they are diurnal. Diurnal simply meaning that they're active during the daytime. So because they're oftentimes found together and in groups and they're active during the daytime, that means it's usually pretty easy for us to tell when we have ground squirrels out there. And usually that means it's relatively easy for us to tell that they're causing particular problems, as opposed to some other species, which tend to be a little bit more cryptic, a little bit more challenging to see out there, can make them a little bit more difficult to figure out if they're causing damage or not. Now, the damage that ground squirrels cause can be quite extensive and quite varied. It includes girdling of trees, so sometimes they'll climb up in the trees and start feeding on the bark. They consume forbs and grasses. They chew on irrigation lines, and in fact, this is one of the more common forms of damage that we see with ground squirrels, resulting in millions of dollars of losses associated with that chewing on drip line. And then their abundant burrow openings cause lots of potential problems as well. If those burrows are around the base of the tree, like they oftentimes are, then you get heavy rainfall events with substantial winds that can actually lead to trees falling over. There's certainly hazards to farm workers, hazards to farm equipment. We can see increased soil erosion from water channeling down those burrow systems. So lots of potential problems that we can see when it comes to ground squirrels. Here at the bottom left, you see the results of a study I was involved with a number of years ago looking at loss in revenue. And we see that certainly ground squirrels cause a substantial loss in revenue for a variety of crops, talking about tree fruit, more specifically here today, close to 5.5% loss in revenue when ground squirrels are present. So certainly they do cause a substantial amount of damage. We're also going to be talking about pocket gophers today. Gophers are, of course, burrowing rodents that spend the vast majority of their life below ground. They are about 6 to 8 inches in length, have a pretty short tail. But because they are rarely seen above ground, we generally have to look for some other form of sign to know that they're present in a particular area. Here at the bottom right, we have a photo of what a typical gopher mound will look like, usually horseshoe-shaped in appearance, with a plug towards the lower end of one side of that mound. Now, gophers certainly can cause quite a bit of damage as well. The types of damage that they cause can also be quite varied. We do see direct consumption of root systems of a variety of different plants, including trees. Probably one of the most common forms of damage that we see with gophers. But with tree crops, they will also girdle trees below ground. Girdling damage that occurs above ground is usually from other species, but that when we see it occurring from ground level to below ground level, that's usually from pocket gophers. And then their mounds also cause a lot of the same problems that we see with ground squirrel burrow systems, such as potential damage to farm equipment, hazards to farm labor, increased soil erosion concerns. They can also lead to a proliferation of weeds. Basically, when they're creating those burrow systems, they bring that soil up to the surface, and that soil oftentimes contains weed seed. So lots of potential problems associated with gophers as well. And again, looking at some of my past work, we see that gophers cause similar losses in revenue as compared to ground squirrels, close to 5.5% again, and tree fruit. Meadow voles are another species that we commonly encounter in citrus crops. Meadow voles are also sometimes referred to as meadow mice. They are small rodents, about 4 to 6 inches in length. However, they are a little bit larger than your standard house mouse or deer mouse, and so that's one diagnostic you can use to differentiate between them. One of the really challenging aspects about voles, though, is that their populations do tend to cycle quite a bit. So you can have relatively low densities of voles in a given area for several years. In fact, maybe you don't even really recognize that they're there, and certainly not seeing any kinds of damage associated with them. But then in a matter of just a couple of months, those populations can really explode. And it literally can feel like you are being overrun by voles in some of those kinds of situations. And as you can imagine, when those populations get to those really extreme densities, they can start to cause pretty substantial losses. As far as damage from voles, the most common type of damage that we see is direct girdling of those trees, particularly newly planted trees. That kind of girdling damage usually occurs from ground level up to maybe 6 to 8 inches above ground. They don't go much higher than that, generally speaking, because voles do not climb very well. So we usually don't see vole damage up in the trees. Once in a blue moon, we might see that, but it's very rare. Usually vole girdling damage is from ground level and up. And then also, I will just quickly mention, voles will chew on irrigation lines too. Pretty much all rodent species will. And then I'm going to be talking a fair amount about roof rats today as well. Roof rats cause extensive damage in citrus crops. Roof rats are not native to California. They're not native to the US. They're an invasive species, although they have been around for several centuries now. Kinds of damage that we commonly see with roof rats include direct feeding of the fruit itself. This is very characteristic damage that we see in oranges, oftentimes chewing their way into the interior of the fruit and then hollowing out the fruit. Something a little bit different is seen in Meyer lemons. They oftentimes eat the rind off of the lemon and leave the fruit itself. So you might see the fruit hanging in the tree without the rind anymore. It's kind of an interesting experience. And then they also do like to girdle trees as well. This is very common in certain citrus crops. I've seen it a lot in lemons, and yet I don't see it in oranges as much. So for some reason, perhaps they like the lemon bark, the cambium layer of the trees a little bit better. But that certainly can cause losses as well. Keep in mind, rats will hang out on the ground and up in the trees, so you do see nests up in the trees, but you can also see burrow openings on the ground, oftentimes around the base of the tree. And as we continue to move along here, I wanted to mention real quick, I'm sure a bunch of you have questions. I do have a fair amount of content here today. So I'm going to spend most of my time working through the content that I have so that we can get done in the time frame that we're allotted here today. But then I'll be taking all questions that anybody has at the end of the presentation. So for those of you who have to cut out, you'll be able to do so. But that way I can answer anybody's questions at the end, should you have any. But keeping on the current theme, moving into, so we've basically introduced, some of the different species that I'm going to be talking about here today. So now it's time to kind of segue into how we want to manage these species. And it's important that as we go throughout this presentation here today, to keep in mind that we always want to try to focus on utilizing an integrated approach. And of course, with an integrated approach, essentially what I'm talking about is using multiple strategies. We generally find that we have better success if we use multiple strategies than if we rely on any single one approach. And there's lots of different examples that could be provided for this. One example would be for pocket gophers, and that's kind of what I'm illustrating here. Let's say you have an extensive gopher problem in a particular orchard, and maybe you decide that bait application is the way that you want to initially try to knock down that population. So maybe you go through that area and you apply bait to knock it down. And then perhaps a couple weeks later, you come back through with a trapping regime to try to further reduce that population. In this case, mixing and matching those tools is certainly a very justifiable approach. And the reason why is, if you're using bait, not all individuals in a population may want to consume that bait. So if you keep using bait, you're going to continue to miss that segment of the population, and odds are that segment of the population is going to expand over time. And so you're going to have an increasing problem. Likewise with trapping, some individuals are pretty trap shy. So trapping maybe by itself isn't enough to get rid of enough of the gophers out there for you to keep you happy. So it is important to remember that we do need to mix and match these tools to maximize the effectiveness of our management programs. It's also important to understand a little bit about the biology of the species that we're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that we're working in, as this can greatly influence the efficacy of management programs as well. And so what we have here on this particular slide is a chart for California ground squirrels. And I think it does a really good job of helping to illustrate this point. What we see on this chart are major activity periods for ground squirrels, major food sources, and then the best time for control for 3 of the more commonly used strategies for managing ground squirrels. And of course, that's broken down across the different seasons of the year. So what do we look at? What do we notice when we first look at this particular chart? One of the things that I key in on first are food sources. We see that ground squirrels are feeding on 2 different food resources throughout the year. Early in the year, it's green foliage, then switching over to seeds. Why is this important? Well, it's important because we want to use rodenticide baits as a tool to try to manage ground squirrels. We have to keep in mind that those baits are seed or pelletized type products. Yet ground squirrels are only feeding on seeds at certain times of the year. So if we want to use bait application for ground squirrels, we generally need to wait until later in the year after that green foliage senesces. That's when the ground squirrels are actively feeding on seeds. That's when bait application is going to be most effective. So what might we do? What might we use if we wanted to try to manage ground squirrels early in the year? Certainly that's a great time to try to manage ground squirrels. So what can we use? They're eating green foliage. Maybe we're not going to be very successful with a baiting program. Well, we see at that time of year, burrow fumigation works really well, yet it does not work very well later in the year. The reason why is that for those burrow fumigants to be effective, we generally need high soil moisture. When we have high soil moisture, that closes off the pores and it holds those toxic gases in at a much greater rate. Here in California, most of our natural precipitation occurs in winter through springtime, so that's really the best time for us to try to use those burrow fumigants. So those are just a couple of examples of how knowing a little bit about the biology of the species that you're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that you're working in, can greatly influence the efficacy of your management programs. So, doing good so far. Moving on, now we're going to start focusing the rest of our time here today on some of the different control options that are available for managing these species. And this chart gives you an idea of some of the different options that we have for managing burrowing rodents. You see that some of the tools can be effective and practical for all the species we're talking about today, such as habitat modification and bait application. Burrow fumigation is effective for some. Question marks for voles and rats, primarily because their burrow systems tend to be too shallow for fumigants to work very well, but there are some situations in which they are used and some situations where they can be effective. For trapping, trapping for voles is generally not practical because they tend to be too numerous, although you certainly can catch voles in traps fairly easily. For field use, exclusion is pretty much only practical for voles. And for repellents, there's a question mark for voles. There is a repellent called anthraquinone, and I was engaged in a study a couple years back looking at the efficacy of it, and we proved that it is in fact highly efficacious at reducing growing damage by voles in citrus in particular, but for a variety of different tree crops. However, it's not currently registered yet. They are going through the registration process. There is a hope that within 1 to 2 years that it will be available, but it's not available yet. Repellents generally are not effective for the other species. Same thing for frightening devices. And then shooting, very quickly, I will mention, can be an effective tool to reduce ground squirrel populations, but in orchard systems that tends to be pretty challenging. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore here today. Now, as I mentioned, one of the tools that can be effective for a wide variety of rodent species is habitat modification. And with habitat modification, of course, what I'm talking about is altering the desirability of an area for a particular pest species. There's lots of different ways we can do that for all the different species we're talking about here today. One example pertains to brush or pruning piles. If you have brush or pruning piles around the edge of an orchard or within an orchard, it's important to understand that those are really good harborage sites for a variety of different rodent species, such as rats, ground squirrels, even rabbits and other species maybe that we're not talking about today. So getting rid of those brush or pruning piles gets rid of some of that preferred habitat out there for these species. And so that can be a good initial step to help reduce potential problems with some of these critters. Burrow destruction is another good potential tool. With burrow destruction, we're primarily talking about deep ripping. This is most practical, obviously, when taking an orchard out of production and replanting. So if you had extensive problems, if you have extensive burrow systems of either ground squirrels or pocket gophers out there in an area and you're going to replant it, it could be a really good strategy to first get rid of the gophers and ground squirrels and then to immediately come through and deep rip to destroy those old burrow systems. That slows down the potential for reinvasion and allows you to gain the upper hand initially on some of those rodent populations. You do have to get to the proper depth with ground squirrels. Some past research conducted by a colleague of mine showed you had to be 1.5 feet deep. So you do have to get pretty deep for ground squirrels. For gophers, nobody's officially tested it. My guess is somewhere between 1 foot to 1.5 feet for gophers to maximize the efficacy of that kind of burrow destruction program. Voles are another species for which we can use habitat modification. In fact, habitat modification is one of the best tools we have for managing vole populations. And the reason why is that voles are very cover dependent. If there's a lot of cover out there, the voles can hide and then they can cause all kinds of damage. But if you get rid of that cover, they now no longer have anywhere to hide, and so they'll have to move on or risk being predated upon by a variety of different predators out there who love to eat voles. So if you can keep row middles mowed really low, preferably stubble heights of 2 inches or less, that's a really great tool. And keeping the areas, the berms and whatnot right next to the trees devoid of vegetation is a really good strategy as well. So doing both of those will substantially reduce potential problems that you might have with voles. Now for voles, we can also use tree protectors as a form of exclusion to reduce growing damage. This is usually used through a hard plastic type tube that's used around the base of newly planted trees. It is important if you're going to use these kinds of tree protectors that you bury those tree protectors a few inches into the ground, preferably 5 to 6 inches deep. If you just lay them on the top or the surface of the soil, what happens is the voles will just crawl right up and inside that protector. And now you've created the perfect habitat for voles. They have a ready food source and they have protection. And we can actually see increased damage when using tree protectors if they are not used properly. So make sure if you're going to use tree protectors that you do use them in an effective manner. Of course, in many situations, these rodents will become readily established in an orchard, and at that point in time, you have to utilize some tools to get rid of them. And trapping is one of the tools that we do commonly use to manage burrowing rodent species. I'm going to start off by talking about trapping for ground squirrels. Now, for ground squirrels, there's a variety of different kinds of traps out there, but they basically fall into two categories, and those are your kill traps and your live traps. The kill traps are just like they sound. They kill the target animal after capture. And examples of this would include body gripping traps, such as the Conibear 110. There are tube or tunnel style traps that can be used. There's also box type squeeze traps that are similar to gopher box traps that can be used. As I mentioned, these are all examples of kill traps. If you're in areas where you're concerned about non-target captures, particularly pets such as cats and dogs, or perhaps species of special concern such as kit foxes or burrowing owls, in those situations you probably do not want to use kill traps, and in those situations you might want to use live traps, because if you capture the target animal or non-target animal in a trap like this, you just open up the door and let the animal out, and it's unharmed from that process. And so live traps are really nice from that perspective. There's several different examples of live traps out there. Certainly the tomahawk or have a heart style cage traps are some of the most commonly used. There are multi-catch traps out there as well, such as the squirrelinator, the black fox repeating trap. These are oftentimes thinner type traps. They're not quite as tall, and they have a one-way door on it. Think of it like a one-way swinging pet door. And so the squirrel is able to push that door open, it pops up, and they pop on into the trap, but then they can't get back out. And in so doing, you can actually catch a bunch of squirrels at once. So again, those are examples of live traps. So as you can imagine, both of these styles of traps have their pluses and minuses. Positives of the kill trap is that if you do capture the ground squirrel in the trap, it kills the animal for you, so you don't have to go through the euthanizing process, and so that can be a real benefit. But of course, the downside is that they're relatively indiscriminate. If you catch a non-target animal in the trap, they can kill that animal just as quickly as it would the target species, and so you have to be very careful there. In those situations, as I mentioned, the live trap is probably the better tool to use. But if you use live traps, you have to be aware of the fact that you are going to have to euthanize the animal after capture. And this is important that everybody always understands before they start their trapping program, because a lot of people think that you can live trap something like a ground squirrel and then take it somewhere else and release it. And the reality of that is that you cannot do that. It is illegal to translocate wildlife in the state of California, including ground squirrels. And so if you do capture the target animal, your options are to release it immediately at the site where you captured it. And if you're going to do that, why trap it to begin with? Or number two, to euthanize the animal. So of course, if we're going to euthanize the animals, we need to do so in a humane manner. There are two techniques currently considered humane by the American Vet Association. The first one is shooting, and the other is the use of a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber. Shooting is probably the simplest approach, but keep in mind there are many parts of the state where you're not allowed to discharge a firearm. And so if you're in one of those areas, that's not going to be an option for you. In those situations, your only other option really is the use of a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber. These are basically just devices where you take the trap with the animal inside it, slide it down into it, close the lid, and then you pump carbon dioxide from a container directly into the trap. There's specific directions on how to do this. If anybody's interested, there's a ground squirrel best management practices website that goes through this entire process, and I have a link for that at the end of this presentation here today. So do keep that in mind, but it is important that everybody understands that aspect. The last thing I will mention on this here is that drowning is not considered a humane form of euthanasia, and more importantly, here in the state of California, it is illegal to euthanize animals via drowning. And this is important, I think, to mention, because for years it was considered an appropriate form of euthanasia, and beyond that, there are actually still some traps being sold in the state, particularly a lot of those multi-catch traps that when they're sold, they come with a container to drown the animals in, but that's not legal here in California. It's important that everybody understands that. Now, trapping is also commonly used to manage pocket gopher populations. In fact, I think it's a very good tool when it comes to managing gophers. Of course, there's a wide variety of different traps out there in the market. I have a book that was published by a colleague of mine many years ago on different kinds of traps that have been patented for gophers over the last 100 years, and it's probably an inch to an inch and a half thick. So there's no shortage of different kinds of traps out there. But basically, they all fall into two general categories, and those are your squeeze type traps and your pincher style traps. Squeeze type traps would include something along the lines of the Victor black box like you see here. There's also a newer trap that's being sold quite a bit and used quite extensively called the Gopher Hawk, which is another example of what I would consider a squeeze type trap. And then there are also pincher style traps, such as the Maccabee, which has been around for well over 100 years and is very commonly used here in the state. The Gophinator has been around for 10 to 15 years. It's a pretty commonly used trap as well. And then the cinch trap is another trap that's been around for a really long time. But there's a wide variety of other traps out there as well, such as the Victor Easy set, Johnson's Quick Set, DK1. There's a variety of different kinds of traps out there. But of course, everybody always asks which one is the most effective. And, I certainly haven't had the time to test them all head to head, but we have run some fairly extensive testing between two of these traps, and those are the Maccabee trap and the Gophinator. And I focused on those because the Maccabee was generally the most commonly used trap in the state, and the Gophinator was a very new trap at the time that seemed to hold a lot of promise. So we have done some pretty extensive testing with those two traps. And here's some of the results of that testing here at the bottom left. Essentially what we found out is that the Gophinator trap was actually a more effective trap. And it was more effective because it captured larger gophers at a greater rate. And that's what this chart is illustrating. Along the x-axis here, we have the different size classes of gophers. Along the y-axis, we have the capture rate. And of course, this is broken down by the different kinds of traps. The Gophinator represented by the solid line and the Maccabee represented by the dashed line. And you see that for the smallest size class of gopher, it didn't matter what trap we used. They both worked equally well. But as we got into the larger and larger size classes of gophers, we started to capture proportionally more and more of them when using the Gophinator. In fact, this relationship was almost completely linear. Essentially what this illustrated is that for each size class up in size that we had for gophers, we started to capture about 23 to 25% more gophers when using the Gophinator. And that's for each size class up, to the point when we were getting up to those larger and larger size classes, we were catching more and more, to the point where we were out to this largest size class, we were still catching them with the Gophinator, and we were no longer catching any at all with the Maccabee. So certainly from our experience, the Gophinator trap tested quite well, and it is the trap that I have used for the other studies that I've been involved with here, looking at trapping as a tool for managing gophers. Now, we're also interested in looking at whether or not it was important to cover trap sets or whether or not we could leave those trap sets uncovered. The basic premise being, if you cover the trap set, you're creating the illusion that there's nothing wrong within that tunnel system. So hopefully you catch gophers at a greater rate. But conversely, if you leave those trap sets open, you could potentially be encouraging investigation of that site by gophers, potentially increasing capture rates as well. So we did look at that over a number of different locations throughout the state as well. And what we ended up finding out is that it really didn't matter a whole lot whether or not we covered or uncovered those trap sets. We did have a slight increase in capture efficiency when using covered trap sets during late spring through early summer, kind of the hotter times of the year. But that slight increase in efficiency was actually offset by the amount of time it took to cover and uncover those trap sets, to the point where we were actually catching the same number per day, regardless of whether or not we were covering or leaving those trap sets uncovered. And as we moved into the cooler times of year, particularly in fall season, we actually saw a slight increase in capture efficiency when using uncovered trap sets. So I generally use uncovered trap sets because it's just quicker and easier for me. But certainly some people do like to use cover trap sets, and they work equally as well. And covering can be good if you're concerned about non-targets, particularly pets, gaining access to the trap. So they can be a good tool to use in that situation. We also have looked at some attractants, such as some of these that we see in the bottom right of this slide here, things like peanut butter. We use carrot infused petroleum jelly and some other options as well to see if we could potentially increase capture efficiency. And in this case, we really didn't see any benefit to using an attractant. It turns out gophers are quite easy to catch, and attractants really aren't necessary. And then we also looked at human scent. Is it important to eliminate human scent from traps and trap sets, or can we handle traps with bare hands? Can we use our fingers to feel around in the tunnel systems to figure out where they're branching and things along those lines? In this case, the results were very clear. There was absolutely no difference whatsoever when using traps with bare hands versus eliminating all scent from those traps. So human scent really doesn't seem to have any impact on gopher trapping. So we talked about some tools to try to increase the efficiency and efficacy of trapping programs, but we really haven't talked about how effective trapping actually is. Turns out it's quite effective. We looked at it in a couple of different cropping systems, including wine grapes and alfalfa. And we saw in both cases, after 2 trapping sessions, we were about 92 to 94% removal rates of gophers from those fields. And in fact, I have some other data that I don't have here today that shows that we can completely eliminate gophers in some situations after 3 trapping sessions in fields. So trapping is certainly a very effective tool when it comes to managing gophers. I did want to talk a little bit about trapping for roof rats as well. We can trap to remove roof rats from orchard systems. The photo at the bottom left is an example of our trapping efforts in citrus crops earlier this year using live traps. In this case, we put out 50 traps over about maybe a 2 to 2.5 acre area, and came back the next day and already had 25 rats. So obviously there are lots of rats out there in this area. And so we certainly can catch them. If you're going to use trapping, I recommend going with an elevated approach, putting them up in trees. We like to use wooden boards and put the traps on those boards. But if the canopy is such that you can kind of string the traps out without the boards, that certainly can work too. You can also use standard rat snap traps to catch rats. Maybe perhaps you might put them in a tunnel system like this, or you can just simply nail them onto a board or on the branches of trees, or use zip ties to tie them up there, etc. You can catch rats that way. It's not that difficult to catch at least some. It's difficult to catch some of the smarter ones out there though, and trapping certainly does take a fair amount of effort. So there is that potential downfall associated with it. I would also mention for trapping, there's another newer design trap out there on the market called the A24. The A24 was initially developed by Good Nature in New Zealand for some of their conservation efforts. It hasn't been looked at very extensively in agricultural systems yet. I actually have a proposal in the works right now to see if we can test that this coming year. We'll see if it gets funded or not. I hope it does. But basically what this is it's a repeating trap. You put it up in the tree, it's got an automatic lure, and it just basically excretes that lure periodically over time to attract the animal in. The rat comes along, it crawls up in, and it hits this little trigger mechanism, which fires a CO2 activated bolt, which will basically crush the skull of the rat. So it's considered a very humane trap, kills the animal almost instantly. The animal falls down, and then of course it can be scavenged by other animals out there safely. So this kind of trap is out there. It's available for use here in California. It does fire 24 times off of one CO2 cartridge, and it automatically resets itself after it fires. So once you put the trap up, in theory, you can go a month or several months even before you have to go back and check that trap again. So it kind of does the work for you. So that's the real benefit of it. The downside is that they're pretty expensive, $170 to $200 per trap. So there is a pretty substantial outlay initially for that. They should last several years. So hopefully you'll get some benefit, and certainly you'll be saving a lot on labor costs because you don't have to go out there and reset, rebait, check near as consistently as you would with some of the other traps. So there is some potential for this trap, but it really hasn't been tested yet in these kind of settings. And so I'm really just not sure how effective or practical it will be yet. So we're getting down to the home stretch. We got two other primary sections we want to cover. That's bait application and burrow fumigation. So for baiting, when we're talking about baiting, we're generally talking about the use of poison baits or rodenticides to manage these vertebrate pest species. There's a variety of different active ingredients out there available for use. These include anticoagulant rodenticides, zinc phosphide, strychnine, bromethylene, and cholecalciferol. Now, zinc phosphide, strychnine, bromethylene, and cholecalciferol are generally considered acute toxicants, which means they kill after a single feed. The anticoagulants are a little bit more complicated. There are first-generation anticoagulants and second-generation anticoagulants. The first-generation anticoagulants include difascinone, chlorofascinone, and warfarin. These, particularly difascinone and chlorofascinone, are field-use rodenticides, and so they are the ones that we primarily use for managing field or rodents out in field applications. Now, there are also second-generation anticoagulants, which are your more traditional rat and mouse poisons. Those are actually an acute toxicant. They do kill after a single feed, whereas the first-generation anticoagulants require multiple feeds to get a lethal dose. Those second-generation anticoagulants are only available for use in and around buildings. They are not available for use for field applications, have never been available for use for field applications. And there's actually some legislation right now looking to ban the use of second generations in a lot of different uses. However, that ban probably will not apply to agricultural settings, at least right now. So if you're in a situation where you use them around storage barns and things like that, you would potentially be able to continue to use them. But again, keep in mind, you would never be able to use them for actual field rodent applications. So for roof rats, even, for example, you cannot use them out in orchards. Only the first generation anticoagulants would be able to be used in those settings. So it's important to keep that in mind. Those first generation anticoagulants can be used for all of the species that we have listed here today. Zinc phosphide is used for all but roof rats. Strychnine is only used for pocket gophers, so keep that in mind. And then bromethylene and cholecalciferol can be used for roof rats, but again, only in and around structures, not out in field applications. So there are some limitations. So because of that, because I'm mostly just talking about field rodents and field applications, we're just going to focus on these first three here today. So for the first generation anticoagulants, again, this is difascinone and chlorofascinone primarily that we're talking about here. For ground squirrels and to some extent for voles as well, they can be used for spot treatments, broadcast applications, or in bait stations. Spot treatments are where we take a designated amount of bait and we spread that bait very thinly around the burrow entrance. The important key here is that that bait must be spread very thinly around those burrow entrances. This photo at the bottom left is a great example of how not to apply a spot treatment. In this case, individuals have basically piled up bait around that burrow entrance. And that is a very dangerous situation where all kinds of animals can come along and eat enough of that bait to get a lethal dose. That's exactly the situation that we're trying to avoid here. If you use the bait properly, you should only have a few kernels of grain per square foot. So for example, if you were to use the CDFA 0.005% difascinone or chlorofascinone products, that label requires you to take 1/3 cup of bait spread over 40 to 50 square feet. So think about that for a bit. 40 to 50 square feet is a pretty large area. And so you're going to get that bait spread very thinly. And when it's spread very thinly, very few animals are adapted to be able to pick up enough of that grain to get a lethal dose. Ground squirrels are one of those that can. And so that's why we use it for ground squirrel application. Now, of course, that works fine if you have just a few burrow systems to treat, but if you have larger areas to treat, then we can use broadcast applications. And broadcast applications are where you use a calibrated seed spreader to spread that bait thinly over a much larger area more rapidly. Both of these approaches can be used for ground squirrels, but the labels generally only allow for spot treatments and broadcast applications during the non-bearing season, if it's going to be within an orchard. And as we know with citrus, there oftentimes is not much of a non-bearing season, if at all. And so these tools probably have limited utility for citrus crops. For citrus production, probably you're going to focus more on bait stations, which of course allow you to put bait inside the station and then exclude access to animals that are larger than the opening of the bait station. So these are probably going to be more commonly used within orchard systems. Always keep in mind that these first generation anticoagulants are chronic feed materials. They do require the animals to consume the bait over the course of several days to get a lethal dose. So regardless of the tool that you use, you have to make sure that they have access to that bait. So spot treatments and broadcasts, that means you have to apply the bait twice, usually separated by 4 days. Between the first and the second application. For bait stations, you need to always be constantly checking those bait stations to make sure they're maintaining a bait supply. If the squirrels eat all of the bait in 1 or 2 days and then don't get it again on days 3, 4, or 5, it's probably not going to work very well. In fact, you can actually increase the likelihood of those ground squirrels developing resistance, which is not something that we want to see either. So make sure that you are maintaining that constant bait supply while the animals are out there. Now we also can use zinc phosphide, which is an acute toxin for voles and for ground squirrels. It is an acute toxin. It kills after a single feed, so you get very quick knockdown when using zinc phosphide. The downside of it is that it has a distinctive odor and taste, kind of a garlicky type odor associated with it. And sometimes that keeps the animals from consuming enough of it to get a lethal dose. And in fact, sometimes maybe they'll only eat 1 or 2 or 3 pieces of this grain. That can be enough to make them sick, and when they get sick, they'll tie that sickness back into this weird tasting food that they've never had before, and now they've developed bait shyness. In other words, they won't feed on that bait again. So because of that, you're generally only allowed to apply zinc phosphide 1 time per year to reduce the likelihood of developing bait shyness in that population. And also, because of that really strong odor associated with it, we do not use it in bait stations. Basically, that just tends to magnify that odor, and it just doesn't work well. So we only use zinc phosphide for spot treatments and broadcast applications. And lastly, because it is an acutely toxic product, we do not use it in or around buildings. And then we do use bait application for pocket gophers as well. We can use strychnine, zinc phosphide, and first generation anticoagulants. However, I can tell you that strychnine works by far the best of these products. And so that's the only one really that I focus too much on for gopher management. We can apply the bait in 1 of 3 methods, including the funnel and spoon method, an all-in-one probe and bait dispenser, and then a burrow builder, which creates artificial burrow systems and deposits bait at set intervals. These last 2 approaches are really the only 2 that are practical for field application. Very quickly, I will say that I've done some work with elevated bait stations using difascinone grain for roof rat control in orchard systems and found that it works quite well. It is now allowable for use during the bearing season as well, as long as they are in elevated bait stations that are at least 5 feet above ground. That's what the current label suggests. And that's only for the CDFA 0.005% difascinone and chlorofascinone products. I'm not sure that any of the commercial products actually allow for that kind of use. If you want more information on baiting for managing roof rats and also deer mice, which we haven't talked about here today, there is a UCANR publication that covers this, and so I encourage you to check that out, and the link is there at the bottom. Very quickly, because we're running out of time, I want to just quickly hit on burrow fumigation. Burrow fumigation is also an excellent tool for managing burrowing rodents. Of course, with fumigation, we're talking about the use of toxic gases within burrow systems. We already mentioned that they only work well, generally speaking at least, when you have high soil moisture. So certainly key in on those time periods when you have high soil moisture. It's also important to understand you should not be using fumigants around buildings. We don't know where those burrow systems go. Sometimes they go up and underneath structures, and if they do, then those gases can dissipate into those areas and can cause people to get sick or potentially even die from exposure. And that includes pets and livestock as well. So be very careful where you use those. They should not be used around buildings. As far as products, we do have gas cartridges, which are essentially glorified smoke bombs. You light them, shove them down into the burrow system, creates a lot of smoke and a lot of carbon monoxide, which can asphyxiate the animal. They are effective tools against ground squirrels. They are not very effective against pocket gophers. So we really don't recommend their use for gophers, but they can be a good tool for ground squirrels. We also have aluminum phosphides, such as phostoxin, fumitoxin, and weevilside that come in tablets or pellets that you introduce into the burrow system that reacts with the moisture in the burrow system to create phosphine. And this is a highly effective tool, one of the best tools we have out there for managing burrowing rodents, but it is also by far the most restrictive of the products out there. You certainly have to be a certified applicator, file a notice of intent, pesticide use report, there's a fumigation management plan, and a few other steps and hurdles to jump through. So it makes it a little bit more complicated, but it is one of the most effective tools. And so if you're somebody who has consistent problems, it can be a good strategy. There are also a variety of different carbon monoxide producing machines or pressurized exhaust machines that are out there and available for use now as well. We've done some early testing on these devices. We find that they work relatively well for gophers, maybe about 65% efficacy. They work much better for ground squirrels. And in fact, this 66% efficacy value is in really dry soil conditions when fumigants don't work very well. I was surprised it worked as well as it did. In another study where we had ideal conditions, we had 100% efficacy. So I think these devices can work really well for ground squirrels, only moderately well for pocket gophers. I will mention very quickly that I did look at the cheetah rodent control machine as well, which is this modified leaf blower device. It did not work as well for ground squirrels. In fact, we had more ground squirrels after treatment than before treatment. So that one didn't seem to work as well. But the perk machine, which is this device up here, which we have tested very extensively because it was the first one around, it's the one that we tested that worked really well. So that's it for my material, except for the last questions. So let's roll through those real quick.
So on to the questions. The first question we have is, I often see large accumulations of plant material up in the tree canopy. I thought these were roof rat nests, so they actually live in burrows. What are the aerial nests?
Yeah, so I tried to hit on this early on. They live in both. They live in burrow systems and they do live in the nests up in the tree canopy. So both would be the correct answer there. So always be on the lookout for both of those as far as potential sign for rats being present in an area. Something else that you might see, you'll oftentimes see the chewed on fruit and the girdled branches, but I've noticed too, you'll oftentimes see snail shells in like the crotch of branches and things like that. And so those are usually signs of rats eating snails and things like that. So just various different kinds of sign you can look for rats out there.
Okay, and we have a question from Janet. What kinds of baits to have for orange trees that have rats eating the orange trees a lot every day? I need that with my large 5 orange trees. I'm not sure if this is in a agricultural setting or a residential setting, so it might be good to touch on those differences.
Okay, so if it's a residential setting, you'd have to read the label. I mean, certainly any rodenticide that would be applied for rats in within an orange tree or citrus trees, things along those lines, are generally going to be a restricted use product. So you'd have to be a certified applicator to be able to purchase and utilize those particular products. So that's the most important thing to always look at. As far as the active ingredients that are available and effective for roof rats in those kinds of settings, it would be the active ingredients would be diphacinone or chlorphacinone. Those are the ones that I am familiar with, and they certainly do work against roof rats in those kinds of situations. Now, if you're in a backyard setting and you have roof rats in your buildings, in your yards is really small, if you're within 50 feet of a structure, some of the over-the-counter labels will allow you to utilize them outside for roof rat control, as long as they're in self-enclosed bait stations. And those would include cholecalciferol and bromethalin, which are what you commonly find there. But you do have to be within 50 feet of a building to be able to utilize those kinds of products.
Thank you. We also have a question from Eric. For gophers, what is the best way to locate tunnels or burrows to place pellets from above?
Okay, so for gophers, what you need to do is obviously find the mound first. Find the freshest mound out there. The fresher the mound, the more likely that a gopher is still using that part of the tunnel system, because they're always constantly out there digging and creating new tunnel systems. And so what you do is you find that initial mound, and then you find the plug in that mound. And once you find that plug, then I usually go maybe 4 inches, some people go 6 inches away from that plug and start probing. And with a probe, what I mean is, some kind of device that allows you to probe into the soil. I use a long screwdriver, like a 12-inch screwdriver. Some people use a piece of rebar. Other people use probes that you actually can buy online, things along those lines. But what you're doing is you're going to push that into the soil. And what you're looking for is a drop of a couple of inches. So you'll be pushing, you'll get constant resistance, and then all of a sudden it just drops a couple of inches. That suggests that you've found that tunnel system there. Of course, the first time you probe doesn't mean you're going to find it. I usually find that plug, step back about 4 inches or so, and then start probing. And if I don't find it there, I just probe all the way around in a circle, all the way until I get all the way around that mound. And hopefully I will have found the tunnel at that point in time. If I haven't found the tunnel, then I usually give up on that mound and I try to go find another mound that's fresh and close by, because sometimes they backfill those tunnel systems with loose soil, and there simply isn't another tunnel in that area that you can use to apply bait. So there's no use wasting your time trying to find a tunnel. If it's not there, just move on to the next one. Then once you do find that tunnel, then it depends on the tool you're using. If you're using bait application and you're going to use the funnel and spoon method, you basically pull the probe out, insert the funnel, spoon the appropriate amount of bait into it, pull the funnel out, and close that opening up. And generally the labels suggest applying bait 2 to 3 times per burrow system. Of course, we have no way of knowing what's exactly one burrow system from another out there, so it's a best guess. You're just kind of guessing. It looks like all of these mounds are associated with one gopher, so I'm going to apply 2 or 3 times within this area and then move on. If you're using one of those all-in-one probe and bait dispensers, that makes life a little bit easier because it's the probe and the applicator for you. So you insert into the tunnel system, and once you find it, you crank a lever, it deposits a preset amount of bait, you pull it out and plug that up, and it's the same general process. One key, though, when applying bait for gophers is it needs to be in the tunnel system, an active tunnel system. You can't just poke a hole in the ground and apply bait, because the gopher's not going to come along and eat that bait. It has to be directly in their tunnel system for it to work.
And on a similar note, Jean has also asked, for gopher trapping, if you missed with a trap uncovered, but the trap was dirt filled by a rodent, would you increase the catch for that burrow by covering, or vice versa?
So that's an interesting idea, and it's one that I've definitely thought about a lot. It hasn't been officially tested, so I can't give you a definitive answer. But my general feel and my assumption is that if I had a trap, so let's take a step back here first. By missing, I guess the question is, did it actually trigger and snap at the gopher and miss it? Or did it just get plugged up with loose dirt but was never activated? Because if it was never activated, then I think you can still catch that gopher relatively easily. If it was actually triggered and it snapped at the animal, then it's going to be much more difficult to catch. So if it was just plugged, I would I would probably just try to reset that trap somewhere else in a similar manner and try to catch it. One way you can minimize getting those traps backfilled with dirt is by inserting them as far into that tunnel system as you can. The deeper you get into the tunnel system, the less likely it is to get plugged, and the more likely it is that you're going to encounter the gopher before it plugs it. So that's one tip there. But if the trap was actually sprung, and then, covered up with dirt and everything, I think it's worth trying a covered trap set next time. And in fact, that's the one situation where you might even try an attractant. And if you did, I would suggest peanut butter. So if you had a gopher, it set off a trap, you were using an open tunnel set, then I might try to find another site close by where I could reset that trap, put some peanut butter behind the trap so that the gopher has to go through the trap to get to the peanut butter, and then cover that opening up. And that might be a way to try to increase the likelihood that you would be able to capture that gopher after it had already been kind of warned off about those traps. So that's a good question.
Okay, and then we have a question from Ron that says, peppermint oil is reputed to repel rats in structures. Do you have any observations about that?
So I don't do much in the way of structural pest control. I have another colleague who does most of that work. But that said, no, I haven't seen anything to suggest that peppermint oil would be effective as a repellent for those kinds of uses.
Thank you. We have another question. For those of us who are organic growers, I know trapping works, but what about boxes for owls and other raptor predators?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's one as you know, I was rushed to get through the material as it was today. There's really a lot of other things that we could cover, and biocontrol through the use of owls in particular is another strategy that I would normally would try to cover. Um, the short of it is that there's not a lot of information out there to suggest how effective barn owls in particular can be for managing a lot of these rodent species, but it is something that's receiving increased research efforts on. In fact, I'm involved in some projects right now trying to look at that utility as well. I will tell you that at a minimum, it certainly doesn't hurt. And at a minimum, we know that these barn owls and other raptors are eating a wide variety of these rodent species out there. The question is can they eat enough to overcome the reproductive capabilities of these rodents? And are they eating enough of them in targeted areas to reduce those rodent populations? And that's the question that really needs to be answered. No matter what, they're definitely not going to eliminate your rodents out there because they can't eliminate their food resource and continue to live. So the question is can they reduce it to some extent? So we're just not sure at this point in time. Now, if I was an organic grower, given the limitations on tools out there, I certainly think that I would look into utilizing barn owls as another approach to try to minimize some of the rodent problems that I have. Because even if it's given a slight benefit, at least that's a little bit for you out there. Do keep in mind that when you're using barn owls and nest boxes, we oftentimes focus on them, at least in part, because we assume that it's going to be less work when utilizing them to manage rodents. And to some extent, that is absolutely true. But you do have to clean those boxes out on a yearly basis. So make sure that you are getting out there at the proper time to clean out those boxes. And then the last thing I'll mention on this is, barn owls will predate on gophers, they'll predate on voles and rats. And so if you're worried about managing those species, that's great. They don't feed on ground squirrels, in part because ground squirrels are bigger, but also because ground squirrels are active at day and barn owls are active at night. So I would not rely on barn owls to try to manage ground squirrel populations. Sometimes then people try to focus a little bit more on hawks and maybe using raptor perches for ground squirrel control. That said, I have not seen anything to suggest that raptor perches substantially reduce ground squirrel populations in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't hurt, but there's really no data to suggest that that's overly effective.
Okay, we have about 7 more questions. I want to ask, there's quite a few about baits, so I'll ask these two together. Will these baits kill owls or hawks if they eat the dead animal? And then there's also a question that says, is there a bait type that is safer for scavengers?
Okay, yeah, so they'll be related. I'll just try to hammer them out here now. So there are obviously different kinds of active ingredients out there. Some of them do have secondary toxicity concern for scavengers and predators, and others do not for the most part. The ones that have the greatest risk for secondary exposure to predators and scavengers are the second generation anticoagulants. These are brodifacoum, bromodiolone, difethiolone, and difenicum. They are the products that were historically, as in the last several decades anyways, used extensively for rat and mouse control in and around buildings and structures. Those products have never been allowable for use for field applications, but they are more toxic and they have much longer half-lives, meaning they last a lot longer in the animal, thereby allowing for a potential compounding of those products over time if repeatedly fed upon. So those are the ones that had by far the greatest secondary toxicity risk. You're really not allowed to use them for field rodent applications. So from that perspective, they wouldn't be a concern. Now, the first generation anticoagulants, difascinone and chlorfascinone, can have secondary toxicity risks as well. Those risks tend to be quite a bit lower than the second gens because they are less toxic and they have shorter half-lives. But they can still lead to secondary toxicity risks in some cases. So there certainly should be some caution used when utilizing these products. I've been involved in some research with ground squirrels, for example, looking at what proportion of poisoned ground squirrels die above ground versus down in their burrow systems. And we found that the vast majority of them do die below ground in their burrow systems. So that reduces that secondary exposure risk quite a bit there. But some do die above ground. And same thing goes for the other rodent species that we're talking about here today as well. So generally speaking, what should happen when these rodenticides are being used is people should be performing daily carcass searches. In other words, walking the areas where the bait has been applied, and if they find dead ground squirrels or other rodent species, then they should remove them from the landscape to reduce that potential secondary risk. To remove the animals, the easiest thing is usually to put it down a burrow system and bury it, but you can collect them and dispose of them in garbage as well. And in a lot of places, not everywhere, some places have laws against that, so you have to check with your local municipality on that to figure that out. The easiest thing, though, is usually just to bury them below ground. But if you're performing those daily carcass searches and you're removing those animals from the landscape, that combined with the much lower toxicity and shorter half-life associated with these products very substantially reduces potential for secondary exposure when using those first generation anticoagulants. Now, if you want to more or less completely eliminate secondary exposure, then you could focus on zinc phosphide. The way zinc phosphide works is when the animal consumes the bait, it reacts with the moisture and the acid in the stomach to create phosphine, and it's that phosphine that's toxic to the animal. But phosphine is a gas. So when the animal dies, that gas dissipates from the body and there's no more toxin left in the animal. So with zinc phosphide, there's very, very low secondary toxicity risk when utilizing that product. But the downside of it is that zinc phosphide is much more acutely toxic than zinc phosphide. So you have to be more concerned about direct consumption of that bait by non-target species. And so there is that trade-off there. So there's always, some of those things to think about. Also, the other thing to keep in mind, one of the reasons we've always liked to use and focus on anticoagulants a lot is because they have an antidote for it, and that's vitamin K. And so if a pet or a human were to accidentally consume some of this product, you can take them to the doctor or the vet and administer vitamin K and everything should be fine. Versus all the other toxicants that are out there, is no antidote for them. Of course, there are steps that can be taken to ameliorate the effects to some extent, but there's no true antidote, and so that makes them a little bit more hazardous there. For strychnine, keep in mind with strychnine, the bait is only used for gophers, and it's only applied directly into the tunnel system. And gophers have closed tunnel systems. They don't let other animals within their burrow systems. And so that greatly reduces any kind of non-target exposure, particularly secondary exposure, because the gopher generally dies in the burrow system. But in theory, if something ate a gopher that had consumed strychnine, they could get strychnine poisoning that way, but that happens very infrequently. In fact, I know of very few cases where that has happened. And then cholecalciferol and bromethalin are generally believed to have low secondary exposure risk, but it also hasn't been tested to a great extent. Now, again, keep in mind, those are not used for field rodents. They are only used for rats and mice in and around structures. But if you're interested in that kind of information, they are believed to have lower secondary risk there.
So there's one from Ron saying, what is the effectiveness of Rat X non-toxic rat bait, which I think is ground up corn cob?
Yeah, essentially so. It's a cellulose-based product. The short answer is it's not very effective at all. There's been some studies done over the years, including one done in Germany here not too long ago, looking at the cellulose-based products. And if you force feed the rat enough of this stuff, it will kill it, but it has to consume a very substantial amount of this product. And this product is not, it's not something that they're super keen on feeding on. Like if there's alternative food resources out there, they're probably going to feed on those alternative food resources. So all the work, the research, the studies that I've seen suggest that this kind of product is generally not effective for rats or mice, for that matter.
Okay, and then there's two questions about above ground damage. There's one from Craig that says, is there anything to be done to help citrus trees heal from above ground vole damage? And then another from Christina that says, with girdling damage, would you treat the bark with tree seal and or what other product?
And that's a great question, and one this one I don't know a great answer to. You probably would be better off talking to one of our orchard advisors or specialists there when it comes to tree health. I would assume that some kind of protectant along those lines is probably beneficial. But honestly, I don't know the answer. I will tell you that the trees can certainly sustain a fair amount of girdling damage and still come out of it okay. Obviously, they can't be completely girdled or the tree's going to die. And there has to be some threshold. I had a colleague, an orchard advisor, who was kind of interested in looking at this a few years ago, but then he took off. So we never got a chance to look at kind of, where that threshold is as far as how much girdling damage is too much. But so I don't know the answer to that. And unfortunately, I don't know the best way of dealing with the injury either, but I would certainly direct you to some of the orchard advisors and specialists out there, because they could probably help you out with that one.
Okay. And then we have three more questions. One is, would elevated bait stations in the trees work for tree squirrels?
Oh, so for tree squirrels, we're basically talking about eastern fox squirrels, eastern gray squirrels, or western gray squirrels. And for those squirrel species, those tree squirrel species, you cannot use rodenticides for. There are no rodenticides labeled for their use. There has never been rodenticides labeled for tree squirrel use, and probably never will be rodenticides labeled for tree squirrel use. So that simply, it just isn't an option. And as far as even for ground squirrels, bait stations on the ground are going to be far more effective for ground squirrels than up in the trees. Ground squirrels will climb in the trees a little bit, but they spend the vast majority of their life on the ground. So that probably wouldn't be much help there.
Okay, and then we actually have one final question that I thought was two questions. This question is from Jane. She asked, do you put an attractant in the rat traps you put in trees? What do you use?
Yeah, you would use an attractant of some sort. We've actually been looking at several different kinds of products. The simplest would be something like a peanut butter and oat mixture. Heavier on the oats than the peanut butter. You don't want it to get necessarily too gloopy. Um, but some combination of peanut butter and oats, even plain peanut butter, sometimes people will use. There are some commercial rat attractants out there as well, if you want to try them out. Some of those work pretty good too. So any one of those would be a good strategy. If you're finding that none of that is working, then then you can start to branch out and try some other things, experiment with some other things, whether that be fruit or sometimes they're kind of protein starved. And so if there's a way to utilize small pieces of sardines or something along those lines. I mean, rats love to eat sardines. The problem with using a product like that is it's difficult to get it kind of stuck on the trigger enough to where the rat has to pull and push hard enough to activate it. If you just kind of lay it on the trigger, the rat might just be able to pick that up and pull it off and run off with it without activating the trap. So you have to do a little finagling to try to make that work. It's possible that using a piece of nut too, whether it be walnut or pecan or something along those lines, might work too. But certainly I would probably focus first on just like peanut butter and oats or some of those commercial attractants if you want to try those out too.
All right. Thank you so much, Roger, for answering all of those questions and for such a great presentation.
I would,
I do,
Stephanie,
oh, yes?
real quick. We didn't get to my second to last slide, which was a slide that included a lot of helpful, useful links. So I don't know if the slides are going to be made available for anybody, but if somebody wanted to, go ahead and look at that, if they didn't get their questions answered or whatnot, there's a lot of great, useful links for resources there that people could check out.
Thank you so much for attending and for bearing with us for such a long time. We have 80 people here still, so thank you. And have a great day.